The Duke expected Margaret Holt to last 3 days. He gave her a brick cellar built over a burning coal seam, where sulfurous smoke leaked through the floor, and the heat climbed past 140 degrees. Then he dumped tons of waterlogged oak beside it and cut her off from every commercial kiln, fuel supplier, and timber wagon in the district. In 21 days, the Royal Mining Board would decide whose wood would hold up the tunnels beneath Yorkshire. Margaret's father was already in prison for warning that the Duke's green mine supports were killing men. Now Blackwood intended to prove the daughter was just as foolish, and for the first 48 hours, it seemed he was right. Margaret's first batch began cracking apart inside the cellar, one violent split after another, while the wet core remained almost untouched. But when she opened one ruined beam and examined the grain, she realized something the Duke had completely misunderstood. The cellar was not useless. It was unfinished, and if Margaret could control what was happening inside it before the 21 days ran out, the Duke might have handed her the one thing capable of destroying his monopoly. Rain had turned the yard below Blackwood Ridge into brown slurry. By the time Duke Henry Blackwood pressed the silver tip of his cane against the oak beam at Margaret Holt's feet, water squeezed from the fresh-cut grain and ran into the mud. 21 days, he said. Then the Royal Mining Board decides whose timber supports Yorkshire. Behind Margaret, the boiling earth cellar breathed pale smoke through cracks in its brick floor. Heat rolled from the doorway hard enough to sting her face despite the cold rain. Sulfur caught at the back of her throat. A laborer would have called the place poisoned and walked away. Blackwood dropped the deed beside the beam. Her father had called his mine props unsafe. Blackwood had answered by taking the Holt workshop, breaking their supply contracts, and having Thomas Holt imprisoned for defamation. Now, every commercial kiln within reach belonged to a man who depended on the Duke's forests. Margaret bent, picked the deed from the mud, and wiped it once against her canvas apron. Blackwood watched for anger. She gave him none. Instead, she crouched beside the oak. The beam was green enough that her thumbnail marked the exposed end grain. Heavy water darkened the pores. The wood itself was sound, straight fiber, tight growth, no deep shake. Ruined for immediate mine work, perhaps. Not ruined timber. She took one of her father's iron wedges from her pocket and scraped away a ribbon of wet wood. "How long do you expect to live in there?" Blackwood asked. Margaret looked past him toward 14-year-old Tom Bell, who stood beside the remaining stack with rain dripping from his cap. His father had died beneath a failed roof support 6 months earlier. "Long enough to find out what you gave me." Blackwood's mouth tightened. Then he turned for his carriage. Only after the wheels had disappeared down the track did Margaret enter the cellar. She stayed near the door. The lower bricks radiated fierce heat. Smoke leaked from 3 floor cracks, but it did not hang motionless. Near the arched roof, a thin gray thread bent steadily toward a broken vent. Margaret held her palm above the floor without touching it. No firewood, no kiln, 3 pounds in her purse. But heat was rising day and night, and rising heat pulled air behind it. Blackwood believed he had left her without fuel. Margaret began wondering whether he had left her with far too much of it. By noon, Margaret had learned enough about the cellar to distrust it. She tied narrow strips of torn cloth to nails at 3 heights along the brick walls. Near the floor, the cloth barely moved. At shoulder height, it trembled toward the rear arch. Near the broken roof vent, it pulled steadily outward. Tom watched from the doorway with a pocket watch borrowed from Jonas Reed. 3 minutes, he called. Margaret stepped outside before the sulfur made her dizzy. The cold air hurt her lungs almost as sharply as the smoke. She had marked the hottest cracks with chalk. The heat was strongest along the southern half of the floor, where the bricks were too warm to touch for more than a second. The opposite wall remained cooler and damp. It was not a kiln. A kiln required control. This place had only heat, leakage, and danger. The oak offered no easier answer. Margaret selected 3 short witness pieces from the stack and weighed each on an old hanging scale found in the cellar store. She wrote the figures directly on the wood in chalk. Then she struck each piece with the small hammer from her father's tool roll. The sound was dull and heavy. "Too wet?" Tom asked. "Wet is manageable. Uneven drying is what destroys it." She split a damaged end with the iron wedge and showed him the darker wood inside. The outside can shrink while the center is still swollen. Then the surface tears itself apart. Tom looked toward the smoking doorway. Can that heat dry it? Yes. His face brightened. Margaret shook her head. That is not the same as saying it can dry it safely. They spent the afternoon measuring what they could without instruments they could not afford. Margaret held strips of paper near cracks to trace moving air. She noted where condensation gathered on the walls. Tom counted each visit inside and dragged out broken bricks that could later serve as supports. When darkness came, Margaret counted her money again. £3. Not enough for a proper kiln. Not enough for fuel, even if Blackwood had allowed anyone to sell it to her. And certainly not enough for machinery. 20 days remained. A careful seasoning schedule would have taken longer than she possessed. Margaret looked at the oak, then at the hot floor. She knew exactly what her father would have told her to do. She also knew the mining board would not wait for caution. Tomorrow, she said, we try a small batch. Tom glanced at the cellar. Margaret did too. She already knew she was pushing the wood faster than she should. Margaret began before sunrise. She and Tom dragged 6 oak beams into the cellar and laid them on broken bricks only a few inches above the hottest part of the floor. She left narrow gaps between them, then pulled the heavy door nearly shut to trap the heat. It was faster than anything her father would have approved. For the first 12 hours, the numbers encouraged her. The witness pieces lost weight quickly. Steam gathered along the brick arch. Moisture ran from the oak in dark beads. By the following afternoon, Tom heard the first sound. A faint tick came from the center stack. He stopped sweeping ash from the doorway. Brick? Margaret listened. Another tick. Then a sharper crack traveled the length of the nearest beam. She crossed the cellar, crouched beside it, and saw a dark line opening along the grain. Get outside. They pulled the door wide. Cold air struck the heated oak. 3 more cracks answered at once, hard and dry, like thin boards breaking under a boot. One beam split deep enough for Margaret to slide the point of her iron wedge into the opening. She did not swear. She simply carried the witness pieces outside and weighed them again. The loss was too fast. She drove the wedge into the end of one ruined beam and opened a small section. The outer wood had lightened and shrunk. The core remained dark, swollen, and wet. Tom stared at it. So it didn't dry. The surface did. She struck the damaged beam with her hammer. The outer shell gave a sharper note. The center answered dull beneath it. Her father had made her repeat the same sequence hundreds of times in the naval drying sheds. Weigh it, strike it, read the end grain. He had never allowed speed to outrun moisture. Margaret had. A sulphurous gust rolled through the doorway before she noticed how long she had been standing inside. Her vision narrowed. Tom caught her sleeve and pulled her backward into the rain. She dropped to one knee, coughing until the cold air stopped burning. Nearly 2 days were gone. Several of the best beams were no longer trustworthy for structural work. Blackwood had not touched a single one, yet she had damaged them herself. Tom looked toward the ruined stack. Do we stop? Margaret wiped her mouth with her sleeve and went back to the cracked beam. No. She took a piece of chalk and drew 3 words across the brick wall. Height, air, humidity. Heat was not the problem anymore. Control was. The ruined beams became the first materials Margaret could afford to sacrifice. She split the worst of them into narrow strips and made Tom trim each one to the same thickness. Those strips would become stickers, spacers between the oak layers so heated air could move across every surface instead of scorching one face. The heavier work took most of the morning. They dragged loose stone from a collapsed retaining wall and built low piers along the cellar floor, lifting the new stack almost 2 feet above the hottest bricks. Margaret checked each support with a straight scrap of timber before trusting it with the weight. One uneven pier could twist a beam while it dried. By afternoon, her gloves had worn through at one palm. Tom wanted to stack faster. Margaret stopped him. Every spacer over the one below it. He frowned. If they wander, the weight bends the boards before the heat ever reaches them. They rebuilt 2 layers. Nothing about the work was quick. At the doorway, Margaret removed rotten mortar around a lower opening until cold air could enter near the floor. Higher up, Tom cleared the broken roof vent. The moment both openings were free, the cloth strips they had tied along the walls lifted toward the arch. A draft. This time Margaret did not close the cellar. She wanted the heat to rise through the stack and leave. The first evening, the witness pieces still lost weight too quickly. Margaret ran her fingers over one surface and felt it tightening. She carried buckets from the well and poured water over the cooler brick walls. Tom stared at her. "We're trying to dry wood. We're trying to dry the center without destroying the outside." Moisture darkened the bricks. The air inside turned heavier, slowing evaporation at the surface, while the steady heat continued working deeper into the oak. They weighed the samples every morning at the same hour. On the third day, the loss had slowed. On the fourth, it remained steady. No new checks appeared. Margaret rotated the stack nearest the hottest floor cracks, with one from the cooler wall. The work cost them half a day and left Tom shaking with exhaustion, but she refused to let speed ruin another batch. That evening she struck the third witness piece with her hammer. The note that came back was higher than before. "Cleaner." Tom smiled. Margaret did not. She split a small test end and studied the grain under the lantern. The moisture difference was narrowing. For the first time, the cellar was behaving less like a furnace and more like a kiln. But timber that sounded right in a brick chamber could still fail beneath a mine roof. Margaret set the hammer down. Now she needed weight. Jonas Reed had spent 30 years repairing ironwork for the mines, which made him difficult to impress and almost impossible to hurry. He stood outside his forge with both hands on his hips, while Margaret and Tom lowered one seasoned oak prop beside a green prop of similar size. "You want me to tell the whole district your wood is safe?" he asked. "No." Margaret handed him a strip of chalk. "I want you to help me measure when each one stops being straight." That answer interested him more. Jonas built the test frame from an old iron crossbeam, 2 heavy uprights, and a screwjack used for wagon repairs. Beneath the beam, they laid flat stone blocks in measured layers. Margaret marked a straight reference line down both timber samples and fixed a narrow gauge beside the center point. The setup was crude, but the comparison would be the same for both. Jonas tightened the jack. The green prop complained first. A wet creak came from its middle. The chalk line began to curve. When Jonas added another turn, moisture appeared at the compressed grain, and the center bowed far enough for Tom to see daylight between the timber and Margaret's gauge. Jonas stopped. They replaced it with the Holt oak. Margaret checked the supports twice before allowing him to continue. The jack tightened, then tightened again. The oak gave a low, dense groan, but the chalk line remained nearly straight. Jonas leaned closer. "One more." Margaret nodded. The iron frame creaked before the timber did. She raised one hand. "That is enough." Jonas stepped back and looked from the bowed green prop to the seasoned oak. He did not call it miraculous. He did not call it unbreakable. He tapped the Holt prop once with his knuckles. "If I had to stand under one of these tonight, I know which one I'd choose." A small gallery on the north side of Reed Pit needed new supports before the next shift. Jonas counted 5 pounds onto the forge bench for a trial lot. Margaret stared at the coins only long enough to understand what they meant. 3 pounds had been desperation. 5 pounds was proof that someone outside the cellar would pay for the result. By sunset, 4 Holt props were being carried underground. The story traveled faster than the timber. 2 days later, Henry Blackwood's steward placed a short report beside the Duke's breakfast plate. Holt oak had been tested at Reed's forge. Reed had paid for more. Blackwood read the page twice. "Where is she buying fuel?" "She isn't, Your Grace." The Duke looked up. His steward hesitated. "She is using the fire beneath the cellar." For the first time, Blackwood understood that Margaret had not merely survived his punishment. She had made it produce. The first 4 Holt props had been underground for 6 days when Jonas sent word that Margaret should see them. The gallery was low, damp, and cold enough that every breath showed white. Water ran in thin lines down the shale. Blackwood's older supports stood farther along the passage, darkened by moisture and furred in places with pale fungal growth. Margaret stopped at the first Holt prop. Its surface had changed color from the sulfur smoke. a faint gray cast beneath the oak grain. She scraped it with the edge of her knife. The wood underneath was firm. Jonas pointed to a neighboring green prop installed earlier from Blackwood stock. Soft fibers lifted beneath his thumbnail. "Rot's starting there," he said. "Yours isn't showing it." Margaret did not answer immediately. Heat had been the obvious value of the cellar. The smoke had been the cost. Perhaps not entirely. She knew sulfurous fumes could suppress organisms that attacked timber, but mine air was too dangerous and variable for guesses. One clean prop proved nothing. "Mark these 4, she said. "Same gallery, same dates. We inspect them again." Jonas gave her a sideways look. "You could sell twice as much tomorrow if I told people the smoke preserves them. That is why you are not going to tell them that yet." Above ground, the demand was already becoming difficult. A mine agent offered Margaret nearly double Jonas's price if she released 20 props that afternoon. The batch had lost most of its excess weight, but 2 witness pieces still sounded duller at the core. Tom looked at the offered coins. They needed iron, food, more hands. Margaret looked instead at the chalk figures on the witness pieces. "No," the agent frowned. "The roof at Carrow Deep is moving now. Then I will not send them timber I have not finished testing." After he left, Tom kicked mud from his boot. He might buy from Blackwood. He might. And somebody could die. Margaret's hand closed around the hammer. "That is why we do not become him." She kept the batch in the cellar another day. By then, the weight loss had stabilized across the samples. No new checks appeared. The core tone matched the outer wood more closely. Margaret released the lot. That evening, Jonas returned, carrying 2 pieces cut from the wet gallery, one from Blackwood's green timber, one shaving from Holt oak. He set them side by side. The contrast was small but visible. Margaret wrote the observation into her notebook beneath the drying records. Not immortal, not proven, but possibly preserved. Across Yorkshire, the rumor ignored her caution. By the time it reached Blackwood Hall, men were no longer speaking only about stronger timber. They were speaking about timber that might last longer underground. And Henry Blackwood finally understood that Margaret was threatening more than one contract. The second batch proved the first had not been luck. Margaret divided the cellar into 3 working zones. Fresh oak entered near the cooler wall. Half-seasoned timber moved toward the center. The driest props finished above the strongest rising heat, where the draft carried moisture toward the roof vents. She no longer tried to move everything herself. Jonas sent 2 injured miners who could not return underground, but could still sort timber and check grain. 3 widows from Reed Pit kept the chalk records, carried water to the brick walls, and weighed witness pieces at the same hour each morning. Margaret paid them from the first orders. By the 9th day of controlled drying, the new witness samples were following almost the same weight loss pattern as the first successful batch. Repeatable. That mattered more than any rumor about unbreakable wood. Outside the cellar, finished props accumulated beneath tarred canvas. Carrow Deep ordered 12. Reed Pit wanted 20 more. Another mine sent a man with cash before Margaret had even quoted a price. Then the wagons stopped coming. The first driver arrived on foot. "Blackwood requisitioned my team." "For what?" "Estate transport. Says every contracted wagon and mule within 10 miles may be called for emergency service." By afternoon, 2 more carters gave the same answer. Jonas read the notice nailed beside the public yard and swore under his breath. The language was careful. Blackwood had not forbidden anyone from buying Holt timber. He had simply taken control of nearly every practical means of moving it. Margaret stood beside the completed stack. Hundreds of pounds of properly seasoned oak sat ready for mines that needed it, and none of it could travel faster than men could carry it. Tom kicked the wheel rut where their last wagon had stood. "We did everything right." Margaret looked toward the road. That was why he changed the problem. The Duke could no longer claim her timber was useless. He could no longer count on the cellar destroying it. So he had moved the contest somewhere her expertise could not immediately solve. Transport. By evening, one mine agent canceled his order. Another said he would wait only until the board inspection. Jonas unfolded the official notice again. 48 hours, he said. Margaret looked from the muddy road to the long oak props under canvas. She had the timber. She had the records. She had witnesses. But the Royal Mining Board would test nothing she could not put beneath its press. By midnight, the mud had become as serious a problem as the Duke. The finished oak lay beneath canvas in long, heavy rows. 4 men could lift one prop for a few yards, but the testing ground was miles away. Carrying even a small sample by hand would exhaust them before dawn. Tom sat on an overturned bucket, staring at the timber. "So who wins because he owns horses?" Margaret did not answer. 2 injured miners were shifting a rejected beam away from the doorway. One jammed an iron bar beneath it while the other kicked a round scrap of timber under the far end. The beam moved 6 inches with almost no effort. Margaret looked up. "Do that again." They stopped. She walked over, took one of her father's wedges, and set it beneath the oak as a fulcrum. The beam rose. Tom rolled another scrap beneath it. The weight moved. Not far. Enough. Within an hour, Jonas was back at the forge heating flat iron for crude runners. Margaret chose the worst of the seasoned props, pieces strong enough to bear weight but too checked or crooked for mine use. They laid them lengthwise through the yard as temporary skids. The first sled carried only 3 test props. 6 people pulled. 2 worked the rear rails forward as soon as the load passed over them. The sled advanced through the mud 1 yard at a time. Slowly, but it advanced. By dawn, widows from Reed Pit had arrived without being asked. Men unable to work underground came with rope, pry bars, and shovels. Margaret divided them into teams: pullers, rail movers, levermen, and rest crews. The system wasted good hours and valuable timber. It also required no wagon, no mule, no permission from Blackwood. A wheel rut near the lane swallowed 1 runner, almost to the iron shoe. The first team strained against the rope and gained nothing. Margaret stopped them before anyone tore a shoulder. "Unload 1 prop," Tom protested. "That means another trip. It means this trip moves." They reduced the load, packed broken stone beneath the runner, and levered the sled free. By afternoon, the rhythm had become mechanical. Pull, brace, lift, move the rear rail forward, pull again. Some of the oak that might have been sold was ground into the mud beneath the very product it carried. Margaret accepted the loss. Near sunset, she sent a boy ahead with a written notice to the Royal Mining Board. Holt timber would appear for inspection at the appointed hour. No request for delay. No complaint about the Duke. Before first light, the exhausted procession reached the final rise above the testing yard. Tom smiled for the first time in 2 days. Then he saw the wagons below. Blackwood's teams were already lined beside the hydraulic press. The Royal Mining Board began by refusing everyone's preferred story. Blackwood wanted the inspectors to see a respectable supplier challenged by a desperate woman with 1 unusual batch. Margaret wanted nothing except the same test for both samples. So the chief inspector chose the timber himself. He selected 1 pine prop from Blackwood's wagon and 1 Holt oak prop from Margaret's sled. Both were cut to matching length and mounted beneath the hydraulic press with the same supports. Margaret laid her notebook on the table beside the cracked witness piece from her failed first batch. Blackwood glanced at it. "Records do not make timber stronger." "No," Margaret said. "They make the result repeatable." The inspector raised a hand. The pump began. At 5 tons, Blackwood's green pine gave a wet creak. Moisture gathered along the compressed grain. The chalk reference line bowed visibly at the center. An assistant recorded the deflection. The pressure increased. Fibers crushed near one support. The pine bent farther, then failed with a violent snap that threw splinters against the safety screen. No one cheered. Men standing behind Margaret had worked beneath timber like that. The broken prop was removed. Her oak went beneath the press. 5 tons. The line remained nearly straight. 10. A low groan traveled through the oak, dense and controlled. Margaret watched the grain rather than Blackwood. 15. The press frame began to complain. At 20 tons, the inspector stepped forward and examined the reference marks himself. The oak had compressed slightly, but no deep checking had opened, and no structural fracture had appeared. "Stop the machine." The pump fell silent. Blackwood's cane touched the floor once. The chief inspector turned next to Jonas Reed, who produced the dated notes from the wet gallery and the paired samples, showing early fungal damage in ordinary green timber and markedly less deterioration in the Holt pieces. Margaret added her drying records, starting weights, daily losses, rejected beams, and the second batch that had followed almost the same curve as the first. One successful prop could be luck. 2 controlled batches were a process. The board withdrew for less than half an hour. When the inspectors returned, the chief read the decision without drama. Timber supplied for heavy mine support would now require documented seasoning and load performance. Blackwood's existing contract was suspended pending review. Qualified suppliers could submit immediately under the new standard. Margaret did not look at the Duke. She looked instead at Tom, Jonas, and the miners who had dragged her oak through the mud to place it beneath that press. Then the inspector turned to Blackwood. "There is another matter, Your Grace." He placed a stack of old collapse reports on the table. "These warnings appear remarkably similar to what we witnessed today." The investigation did not end at the testing yard. Within weeks, inspectors compared the old collapse reports with Blackwood's shipping records and the warnings Thomas Holt had made before his imprisonment. The language differed. The material problem did not. Green supports had been entering wet galleries before they were properly seasoned, and complaints about deformation had been dismissed as poor installation or bad luck. Thomas Holt's case was reopened. Margaret used the first substantial Holt contract to pay the solicitor who carried the board findings into court. Jonas testified about the failed supports he had replaced. Mine managers produced purchase orders. The inspectors produced their measurements. Her father walked out of prison before the first winter frost. He was thinner than Margaret remembered. When he reached the cellar, he did not praise the racks, the vents, or the rows of oak waiting in measured stages. He picked up one witness piece. "You weighed them?" "Every morning." He struck it once with her hammer. The note rang clean. Only then did he smile. Blackwood's fall was slower. The board canceled his exclusive supply arrangement. Mine owners refused timber that could not meet the new seasoning and load requirements. Thousands of pounds of green stock remained in his yards, while creditors began claiming equipment and timber rights he had once treated as permanent. He was not ruined by one dramatic sentence. He was ruined by standards he could no longer control. Margaret bought one of the saw yards sold during the settlement. The boiling earth cellar remained the center of the operation. Injured miners graded timber and maintained the racks. Widows kept weight records, prepared spacers, and handled dispatch. Jonas supervised ironwork. Tom became a paid apprentice and learned to reject a beam before learning how to sell one. Margaret refused the name newspapers tried to give her product. Unbreakable oak. Nothing made of wood was unbreakable. Every batch was still weighed. Every suspect end grain was opened. Samples were still tested before large orders left the yard. On a cold morning near the beginning of winter, Margaret crossed the cellar, while pulleys carried another seasoned prop toward the loading door. Sulfur still stained the air faintly. The same smoke Blackwood had expected to drive her out now rose through vents she could adjust by hand. On the office wall hung 2 objects, the deed he had thrown into the mud, and the cracked plank from the batch she had ruined herself. Margaret passed both without stopping. Behind her, Tom called out the next witness weight. She checked the figure, marked the board, and opened the upper vent another inch. The cellar went on working,